Production note. This series explores speculative what-if scenarios in history, presenting alternative outcomes to real events. The opinions and interpretations expressed do not reflect actual historical facts.
The year is 1975, and the place is Saigon, Vietnam. For the prior 2 years, the peace for which the U.S. fought so hard during the Vietnam War had been hanging by a thread in Southeast Asia. It was all about to come crashing down on the South Vietnamese people who had been enjoying that peace. Here's President Gerald Ford addressing the nation on May 6, 1975.
We, of course, are saddened indeed by the events in Indochina. But these events, tragic as they are, portend neither the end of the world nor of America's leadership in the world.
In his 1985 memoir, No More Vietnams, Richard Nixon wrote,
I had to deal with other great foreign policy issues during my presidency, but a day never passed when the war in Vietnam was not prominent among my concerns. I hated the Vietnam War, but even more, I hated all wars. I knew that I must not end the Vietnam War in a way that would lead to more and larger wars in the future.
Historians have considered and reconsidered how the Vietnam War ended.
This is doctor, author, and historian David Prentice, who wrote Unwilling to Quit, the long unwinding of American involvement in Vietnam.
One of the biggest what-ifs that have emerged from that debate is, what if Watergate hadn't happened? What if Nixon had entered his second term with not just the full political backing that his landslide re-election reflected, but how he would have conducted American politics and foreign policy looking at Vietnam without the shadow of Watergate.
In this episode, we will explore what might have happened had Nixon still been president. But first, let's listen to the real history.
Tuesday, April 29th. The streets of Saigon, usually jammed with traffic at the morning rush hour, are quiet. With communist forces only a few miles from the center of Saigon, the order to evacuate American nationals is given.
In Washington, President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger directed the last day from the Situation Room in the basement of the White House.
Heavy shelling at the airport destroys planes on the ground. American Marines are killed by rocket fire. For the frightened civilians, the hardest part was the waiting and to be hearing fighting all around you. As dusk fell on Saigon, desperate Vietnamese remained at the embassy gate, hoping against hope that they too would be evacuated. But for them, there was to be no flight to safety.
This is what was happening on the ground in the closing hours of the existence of South Vietnam. More than 58,000 American lives had been given in an effort to keep the country free and independent. But now, within just hours, the empty streets would be filled with North Vietnamese tanks and troops. The Communist North and their Viet Cong comrades were on the verge of shredding the Paris Peace Accords they had signed just over 2 years before. The South Vietnamese people were about to be plunged into a living hell.
It is a problem, and we expect adherence to the agreement.
Here's a press conference from when Richard Nixon was still in office, March of 1973, in which the president foreshadowed these events.
President, are you disappointed or are you concerned that the ceasefire agreement in Vietnam has not been observed as scrupulously as you might have liked up to now?
Well, let's look at what has happened. A ceasefire agreement is always difficult. Now in Vietnam, where you have a guerrilla war situation, where the lines are not so clearly drawn, there will continue to be violations until the situation becomes settled between the two sides. What is important, however, is to note that the number of violations, the intensity of the fighting has been reduced. It isn't zero yet. I doubt if it will become zero in any time in the foreseeable future because of this, the fact that a guerrilla war, having been fought for 25 years off and on, isn't going to be ended by one agreement. Not in 1 month, not in 2 months. But the main point is it's going down.
In the wake of 1975, several of South Vietnam's top generals were brought together and they were asked, what would have made the difference? What would have saved South Vietnam? And they consistently said increased aid, military and economic, and U.S. firepower. And so when we think about, well, what would Nixon have done in 1973 through 1975 in the absence of Watergate, we have to consider who he was. I think Richard Nixon personifies grit and determination. Even his last name means in the Celtic, he wins or he faileth not. And his personal history and his family history is that of a group of individuals that refuse to quit.
In the final days of South Vietnam's existence, many wondered how it could come to this. Was it inevitable? Or was there a different path? To understand what happened, we have to go back to a critical decision made by the U.S. Congress. Despite the Paris Peace Accords signed in 1973 to secure a ceasefire and maintain South Vietnam's independence, the agreement's success depended on continued American support.
I knew the agreement was fragile, but on the other hand, I also felt that with the credibility that I had in the minds of the North Vietnamese, witness what I had done in May of 1972 when I bombed and ordered the bombing and mining of Hanoi and Haiphong, and the Christmas bombing of 1972, I thought that very threat would be enough to at least keep them from launching a major offensive. And let me say that for the balance of my service as president, it did. And as a matter of fact, for 2 years after the peace agreement, the North Vietnamese, while they were violating the ceasefire and so forth and so on, did not conquer a provincial capital.
But that balance was upended in 1974, as Congress, weary of war and influenced by anti-war sentiment, dramatically cut military and financial aid to South Vietnam. Nixon described this moment as a betrayal of American commitments, stating that the U.S. had an obligation to match Soviet support for the North.
You talk about who lost Vietnam. The American soldiers didn't lose Vietnam. Neither did the South Vietnamese lose Vietnam. It was lost because the Congress of the United States, egged on by the media and by the best and the brightest in the intellectual establishment, etc., cut back on the aid, military aid to South Vietnam to balance what the Russians were doing for the North.
Had President Nixon remained in office, he argued, this scenario never would have come to pass.
I am sure that I had been able to stay in office, that first I would have done something in order to prevent what eventually happened. But second, it wouldn't have been necessary to do anything, due to the fact that I had already established my credibility with the North by what I had done just 3 weeks before the Soviet summit in 1972, when I ordered the bombing and mining of Haiphong, even though it might risk the summit, and what I did, the most difficult military decision of my whole presidency at the time of the Christmas bombing of 1972, which brought the war to an end through the peace agreement.
In August 1974, Nixon was gone, resigning in the wake of the Watergate scandal. President Gerald Ford, while committed to supporting South Vietnam, faced a hostile Congress that refused to extend further military aid. Without American assistance, the South Vietnamese government crumbled. What if Nixon had remained president, and South Vietnam had been given the support it needed to survive? So, let's imagine that. Let's paint a new version of events where President Nixon was still in office from 1973 and on, with modern AI storytelling tools. What you will hear starting now will sound like real newscasts from the 70s, and even sound like Nixon himself. Like this.
Good evening. Earlier this year, the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Communist Provisional Revolutionary Government, or Viet Cong, signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending America's involvement in the war in Vietnam. The United States and South Vietnam have honored all the provisions of the agreement. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong have not. They also threatened the peace, not just in Vietnam, but throughout Southeast Asia. The United States will not stand by and watch Vietnam be taken over by the communist forces.
This is the CBS Evening News for April 30th, 1975. Today, Nixon called for a meeting with congressional leadership for additional financial support to fund a new military offensive against North Vietnam. The president's decision comes in response to North Vietnam's ongoing violations of the Paris Peace Accords, which were signed just 2 years ago. Nixon is determined to uphold the terms of that agreement and prevent the communist forces from undermining the fragile peace in Southeast Asia. In his address to Congress, the president is expected to emphasize the need for swift action and continued U.S. commitment to defending South Vietnam against aggression. In a recent address to Congress, the president emphasized the need for swift action and continued U.S. commitment to defending South Vietnam against aggression.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues in the Congress, my fellow Americans, on January 27th, the United States, the Republic of Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending the war and restoring the peace in Vietnam. By signing this agreement, each of the 4 signatories agreed to respect the government of South Vietnam as its sole legitimate government. They agreed to address, through negotiation, not violence, any differences among themselves. They agreed to help build a lasting peace of reconciliation. When I announced this agreement, I made clear that the terms of this agreement must be scrupulously adhered to. I also left no doubt that the United States would continue to aid South Vietnam within the terms of the agreement. Despite the commitment of both North Vietnam and the Viet Cong to abide by the Paris Accords, they have repeatedly violated their commitment. They are attempting through military and guerrilla warfare to overthrow the government of South Vietnam and install a communist government in Saigon. The United States has attempted, through diplomatic efforts, to persuade North Vietnam and the Viet Cong to end their dishonorable efforts to reverse, through force, what they agreed to honor in peace. Although they are willing to flagrantly violate the agreement, the United States must be willing to honor the commitments it made in the Paris Accords. Accordingly, I'm asking the Congress to promptly take the necessary action to ensure that the United States will live up to the agreement. We must, as we agreed to do, provide South Vietnam with the military equipment and material necessary to preserve and protect their nation and their people. We must, as we pledged to do, help our ally as it resists the efforts to enslave the people of South Vietnam under an illegitimate communist regime. And we must ensure that the service of those Americans who fought and those who died to resist communist aggression in Southeast Asia was not given in vain.
Mr. President, many Americans are struggling financially. How do you justify additional military aid when we have pressing needs at home?
Congresswoman, I understand the economic pressures our people face. But let me remind you the cost of not acting will be far greater. If South Vietnam falls, the peace we fought for will unravel, leading to instability throughout the region. Supporting them now is an investment in long-term peace, which ultimately benefits us all.
Mr. President, some would argue that if we do not support South Vietnam now, it could hurt America's standing around the world. Could you speak to how this aid impacts our global reputation?
Senator Monroe, you are absolutely right. If we fail to support our allies, it will send a signal that America's word cannot be trusted. Our commitments, whether in Europe or Asia, rely on our credibility. By helping South Vietnam now, we show the world that America does not abandon its friends and stands firm in defending freedom against tyranny.
President Nixon has received the support he requested from Congress. Lawmakers today approved the additional funds needed to launch a military offensive against North Vietnam. This financial backing will bolster Nixon's efforts to uphold the Paris Peace Accords and stop North Vietnam's continued aggression. The president's administration is already preparing for the swift action, signaling a renewed commitment to defending South Vietnam and maintaining peace in the region. Stay with us for further updates.
This just in from the White House. Today, May 8th, 1975, will surely go down in history as President Richard Nixon took decisive military action by ordering American aircraft carriers into waters off North Vietnam while placing B-52 bombers on high alert. These moves were part of a larger effort to gather intelligence and send a clear message. The United States will not allow South Vietnam to fall under communist control.
America, it seems, has won not just the war, but also the peace.
Breaking now. We've just received word that Air Force One has landed in North Vietnam. President Nixon has arrived following the successful halt of the North Vietnamese offensive. In a historic moment, the president is expected to address both South Vietnamese officials and the U.S. military personnel directly from the tarmac. This marks a significant victory in the ongoing effort to maintain peace in the region. Stay tuned for live coverage of the president's remarks expected shortly.
Thank you all. Today marks a pivotal moment in the long-standing partnership between the United States and South Vietnam. Together we have faced great challenges, but we stand here victorious, not just for ourselves, but for the cause of freedom and democracy across the world. The United States honors its commitments, and we are proud to have stood shoulder to shoulder with our South Vietnamese allies to stop the spread of oppression. This victory is not just a military one, but a triumph for the democratic values that unite us. We will continue to work hand in hand with our allies, not only here in Southeast Asia, but around the globe, to ensure that freedom remains a beacon for all people. Thank you.
Of course, none of this happened. Instead, Watergate forced Nixon out of office early. The North Vietnamese were re-emboldened, they spread communism, and the American people have forever mixed feelings about our participation in the war. If, though, we had won the war, would America have been involved in more conflicts like this? Nixon said no more Vietnams. Would that still have been the case had we been successful in this war? Imagine that.
If Nixon Stayed is a docuseries produced by the marketing team at the Richard Nixon Foundation and the audio team at Foundwave Productions. All episodes of If Nixon Stayed are streaming now, and for more of our work, check out our other original docuseries, Captured, Shot Down in Vietnam.